I've always had a strange fascination with forgotten places, those corners of the world where civilization seems to have given up. Some call it a thirst for adventure, others call it recklessness. To me, it was simply curiosity, a curiosity that had led me into uncomfortable situations before, but never into something that would truly make me question my sanity. Not until I decided to travel alone into the Appalachian Mountains. The decision wasn't planned far in advance. After weeks of being consumed by work and drowning in a routine that left me hollow, I snapped one night. It was 3 in the morning, and I was staring blankly at my computer screen when I began searching for remote places to disappear for a few days. That's when I found it. A small cabin listed in some obscure forum, buried between threads about hiking, urban legends, and survival tips. The post looked almost secret, as though it had been left there, only for me to find. By morning, I was already on the road. The sky was overcast, swollen with clouds that looked ready to collapse. I tossed my backpack into the passenger seat, plugged my phone into the dashboard, and put on the playlist I had carefully curated the night before. A mix of haunting folk ballads and somber instrumentals. I wanted to prepare myself mentally for what lay ahead. Days of silence, far from the city, far from anyone. At first, the highway was familiar. Wide lanes, gas stations, billboards flashing advertisements for diners and motels. But the landscape shifted as the hours rolled by. The wide asphalt thinned into narrower roads, hemmed in on both sides by walls of green. Houses became scarce, then vanished altogether, swallowed by endless stretches of forest. It was as if the road itself was drawing me in, feeding me deeper into a place that would not allow me to leave. I'll admit, part of me enjoyed it. I've always liked the sensation of leaving behind the familiar, but this time felt different. There was an uneasiness I couldn't quite shake, as though the trees themselves were leaning in to watch me. On certain bends, I slowed down and could swear I saw movement between the trunks. A flicker, a shift of shadow. Maybe it was just sunlight breaking through the canopy. Maybe not. Around noon, I stopped at a rusted-out gas station that looked like it had been standing since the 1960s. The place was deserted, except for an old attendant with a hunched back and hollow eyes. He seemed almost surprised that anyone would come by. As he filled my tank, he asked where I was headed. When I mentioned the name of the small town near the Appalachians, he froze for a beat too long, as if I had spoken something forbidden. Then he simply nodded, handed me my change, and turned away without another word. Back on the road, the pavement grew worse. Potholes rattled my tires, and wooden bridges groaned beneath the weight of the car. Streams of black water ran beneath them, reflecting the gray of the sky like polished glass. With each mile, my phone signal weakened until it finally died completely. That was when it hit me. This was real isolation. The digital tether to the outside world had been cut, leaving me exposed and, in a strange way, free. I turned off the music. At first, the silence was refreshing. Then, it became oppressive. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the faint whistle of wind slipping through the cracks. It was the kind of silence that feels alive, thick enough to press against your skin. For a fleeting moment, I wondered what would happen if I spoke aloud. Would something answer? By late afternoon, I pulled over at a makeshift overlook carved out on the side of the road. From there, the mountains stretched out before me, vast, dark ridges rising like ancient sentinels, their peaks hidden behind sheets of mist. The wind was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself that I was only here for peace and solitude. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't searching for rest. I was searching for something inexplicable, something strange, something terrifying. The deeper I went, the more the road disintegrated. Asphalt gave way to gravel, and gravel surrendered to hard-packed dirt. Each bump jolted the car, as if the road itself was resisting my presence. That's when the feeling returned, stronger this time. The sensation of being watched, not by an animal, not by a person, but by the forest itself. By the time I reached the outskirts of the town, daylight was already fading. The last stretch of the drive felt endless. Winding curves, narrow bridges, and walls of trees pressing in on both sides. When I finally saw the dim glow of streetlights ahead, it was almost a relief. Almost. The town was smaller than I'd imagined. A single main street ran through its center, lined with aging storefronts and weather-beaten signs. A diner sat at the corner, its neon flickering like a heartbeat on life support. Across from it, a hardware store with a dusty window display of tools that looked decades old. A handful of pickup trucks were parked haphazardly along the street. The place wasn't abandoned, but it felt suspended in time, like a postcard from the 1970s that no one had bothered to update. I parked near the diner, thinking a cup of coffee might help clear the road weariness from my mind. Inside, the air was heavy, with the smell of grease and burnt coffee. A jukebox stood silent in the corner, coated in dust. Only 3 other patrons occupied the room. 2 men in work boots hunched over their plates, and a woman in her 40s smoking by the window. All of them stopped mid-motion when I walked in. It wasn't subtle. Their eyes followed me, with quiet suspicion as I slid into a booth. The waitress, a thin young woman with tired eyes, came over without a smile. "Passing through?" she asked, her tone flat. "Something like that," I replied. "Headed up into the mountains. Rented a cabin for a few days." Her pen hovered over her notepad, but she didn't write anything. For a moment, I thought she was going to tell me to leave. Instead, she just said, "Coffee?" "Yes, please." When she left, I caught the 2 men at the counter whispering to each other. They weren't trying to hide it. I could feel the weight of their stares, the way people look at someone who doesn't belong. My coffee arrived in a chipped mug, black and bitter. The waitress didn't linger. I tried to focus on the drink, but the silence in the room was suffocating. Every scrape of a fork, every cough, every shifting chair echoed like a warning. After a few minutes, I pulled out my map, an actual paper map, since my phone had long since given up. I traced the route to the cabin, pretending not to notice the woman by the window, watching me through a haze of cigarette smoke. When I finally looked up, she spoke. Her voice was low, but clear enough to cut through the silence. "You're not from around here." "No," I admitted. "Just exploring." Her lips curled into something, between a smile and a grimace. "Exploring. People like you always come to explore. Don't stay too long." Before I could reply, she stubbed out her cigarette and walked out, the bell over the diner door jangling behind her. The rest of my meal was a blur. I forced down a slice of pie that tasted faintly of freezer burn, paid in cash, and left under the same stares that had greeted me. Outside, the air was cooler, the sun slipping low behind the mountains. I took a short walk through the town, hoping to shake off the unease. The streets were mostly empty, though I caught glimpses of curtains shifting as I passed. There was a small general store, its shelves dimly lit, a church with a crooked cross that loomed over the square, and at the far end of the street, a faded sign, with the town's name barely legible, like even the paint had tried to escape. I bought a few supplies at the general store: bottled water, batteries, a flashlight. The clerk barely spoke a word, his eyes darting between me and the window as if he couldn't wait for me to leave. When he handed me the bag, his hand lingered for a fraction of a second too long, and in that instant, his lips parted like he wanted to say something. Instead, he swallowed it down and gave me a curt nod. By the time I got back in the car, the sky was bleeding into twilight. Streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the empty sidewalks. The town felt even smaller at night, like a stage set ready to collapse once I drove away. I started the engine, the headlights sweeping across shuttered windows and peeling paint. For a brief moment, I wondered what kind of lives were lived here, day after day, in this pocket of the world cut off from everything. Then I remembered the woman's words: "Don't stay too long." I shifted into drive and pulled away from the diner, heading toward the trail that would lead me deeper into the mountains. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I noticed something unsettling. The same two men from the diner were now outside, standing near their truck, watching me leave. They didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. The further I drove, the smaller the town became behind me, swallowed by darkness. And yet, the feeling of their eyes lingered long after the last light had vanished. The road narrowed again as I left the town behind. Darkness was pooling in the sky, dripping into the valleys between the ridges. I rolled the windows down to let the cool air in, but it only carried the heavy scent of pine and damp earth. My headlights carved a thin tunnel through the trees, and the further I drove, the more the world outside seemed to dissolve into shadows. It was along this stretch that I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a hitchhiker, a lone figure standing by the side of the road, his clothes blending into the gloom. But as I slowed down, I noticed details that made me hesitate. His coat was torn in places, hanging awkwardly, as if it had been dragged through the dirt. His face was pale, stretched too thin, and his eyes reflected the light in a way that didn't seem right. I pulled over a few feet away, more out of instinct than compassion. He didn't wave, didn't signal. He simply stood there, staring at me as though he had been waiting. "Need a ride?" I called through the window. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, raspy, like dry leaves brushing against each other. "You shouldn't go up there." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Up where?" His gaze shifted past me, toward the stretch of road that wound deeper into the mountains. Past the river, past the trees. "Don't go there. Not at night." There was something unsettling in the way he said it, as if he wasn't giving advice, but reciting a rule he had memorized long ago. I forced a nervous laugh. "I've rented a cabin up there, just for a few days." His expression didn't change. "Then don't stay past the third night. They'll know you're there by then." A chill ran down my spine. "Who will?" The man's lips twitched, almost like he was about to smile, but no smile came. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper that I barely caught over the hum of the engine. "The forest doesn't like strangers." That was all he said before he stepped back, retreating into the darkness at the edge of the road. I blinked, and he was gone, just like that. One moment he was standing there. The next, he had vanished into the tree line without a sound. I sat there for several seconds, my hands frozen on the wheel. My instinct screamed at me to turn the car around, to drive back to town, maybe even back home. But curiosity, that same restless itch that had driven me here in the first place, overpowered my fear. I pressed down on the gas and continued forward. The warning echoed in my mind, word for word, as the road twisted upward into the mountains. Not past the river. Not at night. Don't stay past the third night. The way he said it, it didn't feel like superstition. It felt like law. About half an hour later, I crossed a narrow wooden bridge spanning a dark river. My headlights reflected off the water's surface, turning it into a sheet of black glass. As I passed over it, the boards groaned and popped under the weight of the car. I couldn't shake the thought. This must be the river he meant. Beyond it, the forest grew denser, pressing closer to the road, branches clawing at the car like skeletal hands. I rolled the windows back up and locked the doors, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't as if a lock would matter out here. Still, I couldn't help but glance in the mirrors again and again, half expecting to see that pale-faced man following me along the shoulder, keeping pace with the car. But the road remained empty for the rest of the drive. His words haunted me. They sank deep, carving themselves into my thoughts, until I almost began to recite them under my breath. They'll know you're there by then. The forest doesn't like strangers. By the time the dirt road split off toward the cabin, the last traces of twilight were gone. I was alone now, with nothing but trees, shadows, and the echo of a warning I had no business ignoring. The turnoff to the cabin wasn't marked, at least not by any official sign. Just a leaning wooden post with faded red paint, and a half-rotted arrow pointing down a dirt path. The GPS on my phone froze 2 miles back, leaving me with nothing but instinct, and the directions scribbled on a piece of paper. The dirt road narrowed quickly, so much that branches scraped both sides of the car, screeching like nails on a chalkboard. My headlights struggled against the curtain of trees, and every curve seemed sharper than the last. It felt less like a driveway to a vacation rental, and more like a path swallowed whole by the forest. The tires jolted over rocks and dips, sending vibrations up my arms. I drove at a crawl, peering through the windshield for any sign that I was close. Minutes stretched, warped. It felt as though I had been driving for hours, though I knew it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. Finally, I caught sight of it, a shape forming in the glow of my headlights. The cabin. It stood in a small clearing, its wooden siding darkened by time and weather. The porch sagged slightly, and the shutters hung at odd angles, one missing entirely. I had expected rustic charm, maybe even something cozy. But this was different. This cabin looked forgotten. Abandoned, even. I parked the car beside a half-buried fire pit and cut the engine. Silence fell instantly. Heavy and absolute. No crickets. No wind. Just the faint ticking of the cooling engine and the thrum of my own pulse in my ears. As I stepped out, the forest seemed to lean in closer, like it was curious about me, like it was listening. I told myself it was just nerves. I had been on the road for hours. I was tired, and that strange encounter on the highway was still fresh in my mind. But when I walked up to the cabin steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing, not just on private property, on something older, something that didn't welcome visitors. The front door groaned when I pushed it open, and the smell hit me instantly. Damp wood, stale air, and a faint metallic tang I couldn't place. The cabin was furnished simply. A small couch, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace that hadn't been used in years. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs hung in the corners like drapes. I dropped my bag near the couch and ran a hand across the table, leaving a streak through the dust. My fingertips came away gray. Whoever owned this place hadn't been here in a long time. There was electricity. A single switch by the door lit up a bulb hanging from the ceiling. But the light was weak, yellow, and buzzed faintly. It didn't push the shadows back so much as scatter them into corners. I walked through the cabin, checking each room. There were only 2. The main living area and a small bedroom with a narrow bed. The sheets were folded, but stiff with age. A single window faced the tree line, and as I stood there, staring out, I had the uneasy sense that someone might be standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. I pulled the curtain shut. Back in the main room, I unpacked some basics. A flashlight, a few groceries, my notebook. It was strange, but setting those items out on the dusty table made the cabin feel slightly less alien. A little more mine, if only for a while. That was when I noticed the scratches. They were on the inside of the door frame, just above the latch. Long, uneven gouges carved deep into the wood. At first, I thought they might be claw marks, maybe from an animal that had gotten trapped inside at some point. But the spacing was too wide, the cuts too deliberate. It looked more like something, or someone, had tried to claw its way out. A weight settled in my stomach. I stepped back, shining the weak overhead light across the frame, and found more marks along the window ledge. Small, but there. The wood around the glass pane had been etched with deep scratches, as though fingers or nails had dug into it desperately. I told myself it didn't matter. The cabin was old. People did strange things. Maybe kids had broken in, trying to scare each other. Maybe the last tenant had been paranoid. There were plenty of explanations. Logical ones. Still, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the bedroom. Instead, I unrolled my sleeping bag on the couch, where I could at least keep the door in sight. Before lying down, I stepped back outside to grab something from the car. The forest was waiting. That was the only way I can describe it. Silent, motionless, waiting. The night had fallen fully now, and without my headlights, the clearing was drowned in darkness. Only the faint glow of the cabin light seeped through the windows, a weak defense against the black. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the tree line. For a moment, the beam caught on something reflective. Eyes! I froze. They blinked once, then disappeared deeper into the shadows. My breath came fast and uneven. A deer, I told myself. Just a deer. But even as I said it, I wasn't convinced. I hurried back inside, slammed the door, and locked it. The cabin creaked and groaned around me as I settled onto the couch. Every sound, the settling wood, the whisper of wind against the walls, felt amplified, deliberate. I tried to calm myself by writing in my notebook, jotting down the day's events. But every time my pen scratched the page, I thought of the man on the roadside. Don't stay past the third night. I wrote those words in the margin without realizing it. Then I shut the notebook quickly, as though that could keep them from being true. As I lay back, the scratches on the doorframe caught my eye again. I couldn't stop wondering. Whoever made them, did they get out? Or did they stay too long? Either way, I was here now, and I had no intention of leaving. Not yet. The first night in the cabin wasn't restful. I must have drifted in and out of shallow sleep a dozen times, each time jolting awake with the same tightness in my chest, the same crawling sensation on the back of my neck. Every creak of the old wood, every faint rustle outside, seemed magnified in the dark. At some point, I gave up on sleep and sat up on the couch, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. I checked my watch. 2:47 a.m. That was when I heard it. Not the creak of wood, not the wind, but a sound that didn't belong. It came from outside, faint at first, a soft tapping, as though someone were brushing their fingertips against the window. I froze, straining to hear. The rhythm wasn't natural. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. I shined the flashlight toward the window, the beam cutting across the room and catching on the dusty glass. Nothing. The curtains swayed slightly, but the tapping had stopped. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe a branch in the wind, though I hadn't heard wind all night. Still, the rational explanation was easier to swallow. But as I lowered the flashlight, I caught something at the edge of my vision, a faint smudge on the glass. I moved closer, slow, reluctant. When the beam lit the window fully, I saw it. A handprint, small, too small to be mine, too high up to belong to a child outside. The fingers were long, stretched, pressed against the glass with a faint smear that glistened as if wet. My breath hitched. I yanked the curtain shut and backed away. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam jittering across the cabin walls. My heart thundered, and I tried to tell myself the print had always been there, that I just hadn't noticed. But I knew better. That handprint hadn't been there when I checked the windows earlier. I stayed awake until dawn, jumping at every sound. When the gray light of morning finally seeped through the curtains, I forced myself to check. The handprint was gone. I pressed my own palm against the glass, comparing. My hand was wider, shorter. Whatever had touched that window in the night, it wasn't me, and it hadn't left a trace. The day passed in a haze. I tried distracting myself, made coffee on the old propane stove, jotted notes in my notebook, even hiked a short way down the trail to convince myself I wasn't trapped. But the forest seemed stranger now, quieter. By afternoon, I noticed something else. The scratches. I had already seen the deep ones on the doorframe, but now the daylight revealed more detail. I realized they weren't random. The smaller gouges formed shapes, not words exactly, but patterns. Lines intersecting, curling, repeating, like symbols carved in haste or out of desperation. One in particular stood out, etched into the wood near the baseboard by the window. A circle, broken at the top, with a jagged line running through its center. It looked crude, but intentional. When I crouched down to study it, the strangest thing happened. The air seemed colder near the mark. Not a draft, a chill, sharp and sudden, that raised goosebumps on my arms. I pulled back quickly, my pulse racing. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the clearing sank into shadow, I caught myself staring at the tree line again. My flashlight beam swept across the trees, expecting to catch those eyes again. Nothing. But just as I was about to turn back, a sound cut through the silence. Whistling. Faint. Tuneless. It came from the woods. I froze, my skin prickling. It was impossible to tell how far away it was, but it was there, drifting through the trees in broken, uneven notes. I backed toward the cabin slowly, my heart pounding louder with every step. The whistling stopped as soon as I reached the porch. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and pressed my back against the wood, listening. Silence. For a long time, I stood there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. And in that silence, I understood something. The forest wasn't empty, and I wasn't alone. Night stretched like a sheet across the clearing, and for a while I mistook that darkness for sleep. I lay on the couch with my jacket bunched beneath my head, and the faint hum of the single ceiling bulb buzzing above me. If not for the way the house creaked at odd intervals, and the way my own pulse kept time with those noises, I could almost have convinced myself I'd finally found the rest I wanted. But rest didn't come. Instead, the hours lengthened, each minute heavier than the one before. I watched the thin strip of light under the door move and grow smaller as the night deepened, until finally the cabin sat in a small, private black that had nothing to do with stars. It was an enclosed dark, a shadow pressed close enough to breathe. At some point, some undecided hour, I heard the first sound. It was softer than the tapping from the earlier night, Not a knock, but a repetition of a rhythm I couldn't place. A gentle dragging, then a quick scrape, then silence. My muscles tightened, the way a man's do when he knows instinctively that something is wrong but cannot yet name it. I sat up, the cushions sighing beneath me. The flashlight lay on the coffee table, useless in the bright bulb's glow, but I palmed it anyway. The beam cut a circle on the floorboards when I switched it on, an inadequate circle for the size of my anxiety. Outside, the woods made their ordinary sounds. Occasional rustling, a distant twig snapping. But layered under those small noises was something else. A low, almost inaudible vibration, like someone tuning a distant radio. It threaded through the regular sounds, a steady counterpoint I couldn't identify. It felt as if the forest itself was breathing, slow and deliberate. I told myself I'd been away from the city too long. Human brains are wired to find threats in the dark. That alone could make a man hear things. Still, I moved to the window. The glass was cold against my forehead. As I leaned toward it, flashlight held at my hip. At the edge of the clearing, beyond the weak cone of light that seeped from the cabin, the trees were dense. Black silhouettes stitched together. For a long time, I saw nothing but the ragged line of trunks and a couple of shapes that might have been boulders. Then, as if some slow curtain had been pulled aside, something stepped into the narrow lane of sight. It was small. At first, my mind offered a deer, then a fox. But both of those explanations felt wrong the instant I tried to fit them. The shape was hunched and moved in a manner that was not animal. Limbs crossed and recoiled in a peculiar way that seemed to cheat the geometry of living bodies. For just a breath, the thing stood facing the cabin. Then it tilted its head, as if listening, and then it ducked back into the trees like a secret being closed. My heartbeat rose, and I put a hand flat against the glass to steady myself. Of course, the shape could have been a trick of light and fatigue. Of course. But then my fingers brushed a smear on the outside of the pane. A single long streak, as if something had dragged a wet hand down the glass. It dissolved into the fog of the night. Nothing more permanent than breath on a cold morning. Yet my stomach nodded as though I had read a threat written in ink. I tried to laugh it off. Built rational sentences to wrap around the hollow of fear. You're tired, I told myself. You're alone in a creaky old house. You can sleep tomorrow. I taped those words to the inside of my skull and went through the motions of preparing for rest. I checked the locks again, tightened the bolt with hands that trembled, and tucked the flashlight beneath the pillow. Sleep remained a trick the night refused to play. I drifted and snapped awake in little fits. Each time I woke, I listened to the cabin tune itself. Boards settling, the heater clicking, a distant tree branch rubbing a window frame like a finger on a glass rim. Every noise that should have been mundane felt electric. My ears seemed to seek out changes. A step too soft on the porch. The whisper of a leaf in the wrong direction. At one point, sometime after midnight, I heard the sound of shuffling right outside the front door, not the earlier tapping. This was weight against wood. Slow, awkward, as if someone were dragging something. I held my breath. The sound stopped, then started again a few feet away, as if the intruder had decided to walk around rather than through the threshold. There was a slow, circling motion, Then a pause in which the night seemed to listen. I wanted to call out. I wanted proof that whatever was there would be human, and neighborly, and explainable. But my voice felt foreign in my throat, brittle with fear. Instead, I grabbed my jacket, swung my legs off the couch, and padded barefoot to the door. The floor was cold under my feet, and the old wood groaned like an animal with each step. "Hello?" My voice was thinner than I intended. "Is someone there?" A hollow silence answered. Then, impossibly, a sound answered me. Another voice, but not one that could be pinned to a throat. It was a whisper that threaded itself through the wood and into my chest, like wind through a flute. The sound shaped into my name, soft, intimate, as if spoken by someone who had been sitting beside me for years. "You shouldn't have come," the whisper said. It was my name, breathed with an affection that made my skin crawl. It was not the man's voice from the roadside. It was not the woman from the diner. It was some other voice, ancient and familiar and wrong. My hand found the deadbolt. I thumbed it open, fingers clumsy in the dark. The porch lay empty. Dew chilled the boards. Nothing moved. Nothing there to explain the whispering voice or the scraping that continued some yards away, now accompanied by an intermittent tapping, like a metronome. I stepped down, one careful foot after another, and crossed the small yard. The world smelled of wet leaves and river. No smoke, no human scent. The tapping had become a pattern of 3 quick beats. Then a pause. Tap, 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 pause. Then resumed. The pattern had a rhythm so purposeful it felt like speech. Flashlight up. I scanned the edge of the tree line. There, where the light thinned, the underbrush had been flattened in a crude, irregular line. Footprints, but not like any I recognized. They were too long and too narrow, like the mark a hand might leave if you set your palm flat on soft earth and dragged it. The prints led from the dark toward the fire pit near the car, then arced away back into the trees, like a path meant to lure rather than to traverse. I followed them until the beam of light caught on something that made my stomach drop. A small ceramic figurine half buried in the dirt. A child's thing with a painted face long weathered by time. It had been placed where the prince pointed, its painted smile smeared with mud. Why? I had the simple, terrible thought to tell me they were not what they seemed. Whatever had been here had left both an invitation and a mockery. I wanted to pick the figurine up, to scoop it into the shelter of my jacket, and take it inside where it would be safe from the elements and my imagination. But my hands wouldn't move. Instead, I watched as a dark shape moved at the rim of my light, too quick to be slow, too deliberate to be random. The thing stopped at the edge, as though hovering between intent and retreat. And then it whistled. Not the tuneless hum from earlier, but a single, low note that resonated against the trees and made the hair on my arm stand up. The whistle was wrong. It had intervals that were not natural, like a phrase pieced together from several songs and warped until it was almost unrecognizable. When the whistle stopped, the dark stepped forward for the briefest second, and I saw, in the way the moonlight snagged on it, a face that was too long, too thin, with the suggestion of teeth too numerous for a human mouth. Then it was gone, melting into the black as if the night had swallowed it whole. I ran. Not because the thing chased me. Nothing chased me. But because I wanted the light of the cabin and the assurance of walls and a door. I stumbled up the porch steps and slammed the door, hands fumbling with the lock until the bolt slid home. Breath heaving, I leaned my forehead against the wood and tried to laugh. The sound that escaped me was raw and small. Inside, I bolted the deadbolt and pushed the heavy table against the door, more ritual than defense. I sat on the couch with my knees pulled to my chest, flashlight useless now in the white wash of streetlight that found its way through the blinds. I felt like an animal caught, and watching the world from an invisible glass. Only the spectacle was not my safety, but my undoing. Hours passed. The noises outside continued, distant and precise. At one point I heard something that made the world tilt. The unmistakable sound of singing. A low, wordless chant that seemed to come from deeper in the trees. It wasn't a lullaby. It was a sequence of syllables that felt like a language I almost knew and then couldn't remember. It pressed against the cabin walls like a wind that wanted the world to answer back. Sleep finally came in the fragile hours before dawn. A shallow, chaotic sleep that stitched brief dreams together. I dreamed I was in the river, lungs filling with cold black water, and the surface above me shimmered with faces. Faces that were not angry but bored, like something that had been waiting with patient cruelty. I woke choking, with the taste of iron in my mouth, convinced for a moment that I had actually been dragged through a current. Sunlight bled through the curtains by a gray and unforgiving morning. I expected to wake to a world that had been its ordinary self all along, but the clearing looked changed, like the stage of some play after the actors had scattered. The scent of wet earth was stronger, and small tracks led from the tree line to the fire pit again. New scratches marred the wood of the porch, finer than the deep gouges I had seen before. Tiny notches, repeated and patterned. I stepped out with the cautious curiosity of a man who has eaten too many scary stories and now lives inside one. The figurine I'd seen the night before lay where I'd left it, its painted face muddied and its smile vaguely accusing. As I picked it up, I realized a thread, thin, fibrous, almost like hair, was tied around its waist, and the thread led in a broken trail of twigs and crushed leaves toward the trees. Someone wanted me to follow. Someone wanted me to see. I wanted to tell myself the obvious things, that a prankster from the town had crept out to frighten an intruder, that the tracks belonged to animals, and the singing was wind through leaves, that a man alone in the woods can always conjure monsters. But those reassurances felt shabby under the scrutiny of daylight. The patterns left in the wood were deliberate. The footprints didn't match any animal I knew. And the thread, where did it come from? How long had it been there? Who had the patience to arrange such details? As I stood in the clearing, gripping that little ceramic thing like evidence in a crime, the sense I had tried to ignore for days returned in full force. The forest was not merely a place with trees and shadows. It was an organism with attention and habits and, perhaps, rules. I had broken one, or I had walked into one, and whatever meted out the consequence did not mark its law with neatness. It did so in objects, in sounds, in that small, private logic that made the whole place feel less like land and more like a living thing. Back in the cabin, I washed my hands until the water ran clear and sat with my notebook. I wrote down everything: the sounds, the whistle, the footprints, the figurine, and I tried to be precise. Precision felt like power. It felt like an antidote to the strange. But even as I wrote, the words seemed thin and inconsequential, like a man carving letters into driftwood. I resolved to stay, to watch the next night and perhaps the one after. Curiosity is a stubborn engine. It had carried me this far. It would not be the thing to turn me back now. But I also resolved to be careful, to mark the doors, to set traps of sorts. Simple things. Flower at the threshold to capture prints. A line of stones so I could see if anything crossed the path. If whatever lived here communicated by pattern and attention, I would answer with pattern and attention of my own. I pinned the little figurine to the mantel with a scrap of twine and a thought like iron. If the thing wanted me to follow, it would have to work for it. I would not be so simple a quarry. The forest had shown me a face in the dark, and had whistled in a voice that felt insultingly intimate. Now I would show it that I could watch back. When night fell again, I sat awake for hours more, a sentinel in a house that seemed to breathe differently than the world outside. The tapping returned at the same odd intervals. The whistle threaded itself through the trees, and once, right before I drifted into that thin sleep, I heard something that was at once ridiculous and bone-deep. The sound of laughter. Not triumphant, not cruel, at least not purely so, but the kind of laughter that suggests someone has understood a joke at another's expense. I whispered into the dark, not sure whom I addressed. "I hear you." It felt like a poor bargain, an admission of vulnerability. But even the admission had a strange, bright clarity to it. The forest listened and answered, and I realized with a small, terrible certainty that it would not be satisfied with merely being observed. It wanted to be acknowledged. It wanted a story told. And stories, once begun, rarely have tidy endings. The next morning, I stepped outside with a sense of anticipation tempered by unease. Sleep had been thin and jagged, filled with fragmented images of the forest pressing closer than the trees physically allowed. But morning had a deceptive clarity. Sunlight filtered weakly through the mist, painting the trees in pale silver and green. Everything seemed ordinary. Birds chirped, leaves swayed. Yet, as I looked closer, I realized the forest had shifted. The dirt trail to the cabin, which had seemed empty the night before, was now etched with marks that hadn't been there. Small depressions in the soil, irregularly spaced, leading in circles around the clearing. Some were depressions shaped like fingers, others wider, like the heel of a boot. Nothing in my memory matched these shapes. And yet they were undeniably real. I followed them cautiously. Each step brought new evidence of intrusion. Broken twigs arranged unnaturally. A faint smear of mud on rocks placed near the path. Even faint scratches on my car door where no branches had reached. Whoever or whatever had been here. It had been studying me, learning the limits of my awareness, testing my presence in its domain. Returning to the cabin, I found more signs. The figurine from the previous night had been moved. Now it sat on the windowsill facing outward, as if observing the forest rather than being observed. A branch had been pressed into the dirt outside the front door, with small notches carved into it in a repeating pattern. The rhythm of the notches mimicked the tapping I had heard during the night, a code I could not yet decipher. Inside, I discovered a faint impression on the dust of the table. Tiny, elongated footprints leading toward the fireplace. They weren't animal. They weren't human. They seemed to belong to something that walked upright but lightly, deliberately, leaving the barest trace. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps a raccoon had climbed inside while I slept. Perhaps wind had shifted objects. But the evidence was too precise. The figurine, the notches, the deliberate circling of prints, they were intentional. I was no longer a visitor in the forest. I was an intruder. I spent the day fortifying the cabin in small ways, lining the threshold with flour to capture prints, arranging small piles of stones as visual alarms, and checking the windows and doors for marks. Each precaution felt both futile and necessary. The forest had shown intelligence, patience, and a disregard for human boundaries. My measures were only signals. I was watching. I was aware. By evening, the signs escalated. I heard the dragging and tapping from the night before return with greater persistence. My flower lines were disrupted in perfect arcs. Some prints too small, too narrow, to belong to a known creature. The forest's rhythm had changed. It was no longer a simple observation. It was communication, deliberate, coded, and challenging. At one point, I glimpsed movement at the tree line. Not close, but enough to make me freeze. A figure emerged briefly in the dim light, hunched, indistinct, then disappeared. The leaves did not rustle naturally. They whispered secrets I could not yet comprehend. Inside, the cabin seemed to hum in response. The faint scratches along the walls, the small gouges in the doorframe, and the notches outside all suggested a narrative, a story written in wood, dirt, and shadow. I tried to read it, to find logic, but it was not meant to be decoded so easily. By nightfall, I realized the forest was no longer passive. It had begun to actively interact, to assert its presence. And the more I observed, the more I understood. My role here was not just as witness, but as participant. Every movement, every gaze, every hesitation was noted. The signs were everywhere. The figurine, the prints, the scratches, the notches. They were all instructions and warnings, invitations and tests. And I had only begun to understand the rules of this living, breathing forest. By the second night, the awareness of eyes on me was no longer subtle. It pressed into my mind with the patience of a predator. Not aggressive, but insistent, never letting me forget that I was not alone. I moved through the cabin as if it were a cage, and every corner held a gaze I could not see but could feel. Even inside, I felt it. Shadows shifted slightly out of the corner of my vision, too fluid for ordinary objects. My own reflection in the window seemed delayed, as though it were struggling to catch up with me. The hairs on my arms stood at attention, my heartbeat loud in the hollow space of the cabin. I tried to convince myself it was anxiety, the residue of my solitary drive, or perhaps fatigue, but the small signs kept accumulating. My flower traps were disrupted again, perfect arcs of prints showing careful steps around the boundaries. The figurine had moved, again, this time facing toward the cabin door. I had not touched it. I left the door slightly ajar to see if anything would enter. I waited, flashlight scanning every inch of the clearing, but nothing crossed the threshold. Yet the sensation persisted. I could feel presence in every shadow. It was not sudden. It was a slow tightening, like a grip on the mind rather than the body. Even when I closed my eyes, I sensed observation. It was there while I wrote, there when I cooked, there when I tried to sleep. The feeling was all-encompassing. I was a subject under careful, invisible scrutiny. Sometimes I heard movement that couldn't be explained. A branch shifting, a whisper of leaves, footsteps that never approached, yet never receded. It was the rhythm of the forest, calibrated to my perception, and I began to understand that it measured me, studied my reactions, and adjusted its presence accordingly. The night stretched long and thick. Each creak of the cabin, each whisper of wind against the walls, was interpreted by my mind as communication. And perhaps it was. The forest had its own language, its own awareness, and I was an untrained listener struggling to comprehend. In the moments of stillness, I glimpsed forms at the edge of the light. Fleeting, ambiguous, sometimes human-like, sometimes too elongated, too contorted to belong to a person. They retreated the moment I focused fully on them, leaving only the sensation of a gaze lingering, heavy, patient, and expectant. I tried speaking aloud to break the tension, to assert my own presence. I see you. I know you're there. The words felt hollow, even as they left my lips. The forest responded not with sound, but with rhythm. Branches brushing against each other, faint tapping, the whisper of leaves. A deliberate cadence, as if it acknowledged my attempt yet refused direct confrontation. Time became meaningless. The minutes blurred, stretching into hours. I realized that being awake was a necessity. Sleep made me vulnerable, and I sensed that the forest's attention grew more insistent when I closed my eyes. The vigilance was exhausting, and yet I could not abandon it. To do so would be to surrender to the unknown that pressed in around the cabin, to be part of its narrative rather than the observer. By dawn, the tension was a living thing inside me. My body ached, my mind rattled with the constant attention. And yet, a strange fascination had emerged alongside the fear. I wanted to understand the rules, to see the forest reveal its intentions, to decipher the meaning behind every sound, every movement, every deliberate mark left in the dirt or on the wood. The feeling of being watched was no longer simply fear. It was a bridge, a line of communication. The forest was alive, yes, but it was also conscious in a way that I could sense but not fully grasp. And somewhere in that awareness, I felt the first threads of understanding. If I could observe and respect its patterns, perhaps I could survive. But survival would not be simple, nor would understanding come easily. The forest had begun the lesson, and the night was its classroom. Every sound, every shadow, every movement carried meaning. I was awake, alert, and, for the first time, truly aware that the forest lived not just in trees and earth, but in attention, patience, and the invisible currents of observation that wrapped around everything in its domain. By the third night, the forest had grown bolder. It was no longer just subtle signs or fleeting shadows. Now it began to speak in a way that chilled me more deeply than any creature or shape ever could. I had been sitting on the cabin's porch, flashlight resting across my lap, eyes fixed on the edge of the tree line. The night was quiet, too quiet, but then I heard it. At first I thought it was my imagination, a soft, low murmur like someone whispering from just beyond the trees. Then I realized the whispers were words. My name. Are you awake? I froze. The voice was unmistakable, clear, familiar, like someone I knew, someone who had long been gone. My heartbeat raced, and I scanned the tree line, swinging the flashlight in wide arcs. Nothing. Just dark trees swaying in the faint breeze. Come closer, the voice whispered again. We've been waiting. It was not just one voice. Multiple voices layered on top of each other, overlapping like echoes in a canyon. Each sounded familiar. Friends, acquaintances, even family. But distorted, warped by distance or some unseen filter. I could not tell if they were speaking to me, or at me, or around me. Panic surged. I recoiled from the porch edge, retreating into the cabin. Every instinct screamed to lock the doors, to hide, to run. And yet, some perverse part of my mind forced me to listen. The voices persisted. They came from all directions, drifting through the trees. Sometimes just out of reach, sometimes close enough that I could swear I heard my own breathing echoed back at me. They laughed, cried, whispered secrets I could not comprehend. Their tone was not angry, but seductive, an insistence that drew me forward, even as my body screamed to resist. I tried to rationalize. Sleep deprivation, anxiety, the shadows from the past blending with present fears. But these voices carried something no hallucination could produce. Precise detail. They spoke of my past, of events no one else could know. Names, places, memories, sometimes comforting, sometimes horrifyingly intimate. I realized with a sudden jolt that the forest was learning me, probing for weaknesses, for familiarity. And then it began to twist those familiar threads into something else. Deception, doubt, fear. The voices were bait, a lure to draw me further into its domain. I backed away from the window, shaking. My hands trembled. The flashlight's beam jittered across the walls, catching on the scratches along the doorframe. Those scratches, the notches outside, the figurine. It was all part of the same language. The forest communicated through symbols, sound, and presence, and now it had learned to speak in voices I trusted. I sank to the floor, pressing my back against the wall, and tried to quiet my mind. I told myself I was imagining, that the stress and isolation were doing this to me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest was alive. It was aware. It could manipulate perception, it could mimic, and it could terrify with the familiarity of memory. Hours passed. The voices came and went in waves, a chorus of distorted familiarity that ebbed and surged like the tide. I could not sleep, could not ignore them, could not shut them out. Even when I covered my ears and closed my eyes, the whispering persisted in the hollows of my thoughts. And yet, amid the fear, a strange curiosity arose. I began to notice patterns, subtle rhythms in the way the voices called, repeated, and receded. It was almost musical, almost intentional. The forest was teaching me its rules, not violently, not angrily, but carefully, methodically, in its own inhuman way. By dawn, I was exhausted. My notebook was filled with frantic sketches, lines representing sound, notches, Arrows. Arrows that looped in repeating patterns. I tried to decode the whispers, to make sense of the familiar voices that had no right to be there. And slowly, reluctantly, I began to understand. The forest did not merely want to scare me. It wanted me to participate, to observe, to respond. It wanted recognition. As I sat on the porch, listening to the final echoes of the night fade into a gray, misty morning, I realized that my understanding of danger had changed. The forest's power lay not in strength, speed, or teeth, but in attention, in patience, in its ability to manipulate perception and memory. The familiar voices were the sharpest weapon it wielded, because they made me doubt myself, my senses, and my mind. And I had no choice but to listen. By the end of the third night, I realized that staying passive was no longer an option. The forest had tested me, communicated through whispers, scratches, and strange symbols, and I had been nothing but an observer. But the subtle signs had begun to escalate. Prints approaching the cabin closer than ever, shadows moving with intention, the voices calling me directly. It was no longer enough to watch. Morning found me restless with purpose. I paced the cabin, flashlight in hand, trying to plan my next move. My instincts screamed to flee, to abandon the place entirely and drive back toward the nearest highway. But another part of me, the part that had survived this long, insisted I needed to understand. To act, not just react. The map I had brought with me didn't help. Trails crisscrossed the mountains, unnamed paths that disappeared into dense foliage. But one path seemed promising. A narrow trail that led toward a ridge I had glimpsed during my first approach. If I followed it, I could explore deeper into the forest and perhaps see what or who had been manipulating the environment around the cabin. I knew it was a dangerous decision. The forest had demonstrated intelligence. It was patient, observant, and deliberate. Every mark, every sound, every pattern suggested it could anticipate my actions. Leaving the relative safety of the cabin meant entering its full domain. I packed lightly: flashlight, notebook, water, a small knife. I left the flower lines and stone markers in place, not as protection, but as a signal. A declaration that I acknowledged the forest's rules and would play along. Stepping onto the path, the forest seemed to shift. Trees bent slightly, shadows lengthened, and the air thickened with the scent of earth and decay. The path was narrow, overgrown in places, forcing me to brush aside branches that clawed at my skin like the fingers of unseen hands. Every step felt deliberate, measured, as if I were walking a tightrope stretched between curiosity and fear. I moved cautiously, flashlight sweeping side to side, notebook clutched under one arm. The forest was quiet, too quiet, but the silence was loaded. It pressed against my chest, whispering that I was being observed, that I had crossed a threshold. Then, faintly, the tapping returned. 3 slow beats, pause, 3 slow beats, repeating rhythmically. I recognized the pattern from the marks outside the cabin. Someone, or something, was guiding me, warning me, or testing me. Deeper into the woods, the signs became more aggressive. Branches were snapped, not by accident, but in a deliberate pattern. Small animal bones littered the trail, arranged unnaturally. And always, the whispering continued, voices layered and familiar, calling my name, urging me onward, promising answers if I would only follow. The forest was no longer passive. It was active, and I was a participant in its design. I could feel its intelligence pressing against mine, trying to anticipate my thoughts. The wind carried the whispers, The subtle tapping, the rustling of leaves. It was all a single entity, watching, guiding, testing. At one point, I paused at a clearing. Moonlight broke through the dense canopy, revealing a circle of stones, each one etched with symbols similar to those I had seen on the cabin's walls and the scratches by the windows. In the center lay a figure, motionless, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't tell if it was human or not. Its presence radiated a cold authority, as if it were the forest's envoy. The whispers intensified, overlapping into a near-deafening chorus of familiar voices. They spoke in urgency, pleading, mocking, and warning all at once. "You shouldn't have come," one said. "You were warned," another hissed. "See," a third whispered softly. My heart pounded as I realized the danger was not merely physical. The forest's intelligence could manipulate perception, memory, and emotion. Every choice I made could be anticipated, every hesitation punished, and yet I pressed forward. I approached the figure cautiously, each step measured. The moment my foot disturbed the leaf litter inside the stone circle, the forest seemed to exhale. The whispering stopped. Silence settled, heavier than before, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The figure did not move, but its presence was undeniable. It seemed to watch me as much as I watched it. A perfect mirror of tension and calculation. I could feel the pulse of the forest through it, a rhythm in the air that made my skin prickle. Then, suddenly, a low whistle cut through the silence, a note that was not musical but communicative. I realized I had crossed a threshold. The forest had drawn a line, and I had stepped beyond it. There was no turning back, not without consequences. My instincts screamed to retreat, but my curiosity anchored me. The forest had shown me that it was alive, intelligent, patient, and deliberate. To flee now would be to deny the understanding I sought, the story I was becoming part of. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the figure, ready to confront the unknown, ready to meet whatever consciousness lay at the heart of these mountains. And in that moment, I understood something chilling yet exhilarating. The forest did not merely live. It judged, guided, and waited. My decision to step into its domain had been dangerous, yes, but it had also been inevitable. The forest had called, and I had answered. The path that had seemed so clear under daylight now betrayed me under the dim shroud of night. I had left the stone circle behind, notebook clutched tightly in my hand, convinced that I could follow the same trail back toward the cabin. I had marked trees with shallow knife cuts, broken branches to leave clues, even scattered small piles of stones to reassure myself I could retrace my steps. But no matter how carefully I walked, the forest shifted around me. It began subtly at first. A turn that should have led back to the creek instead curved into denser thickets. A familiar cluster of rocks appeared twice within 20 minutes, as though the forest had folded back on itself. Even the air grew thicker, heavy with damp moss and the faint, metallic tang of earth. My cuts on the bark disappeared. Whole trees stood pristine, unscarred, as if they had healed in the short time I had turned my back. The more I tried to navigate, the more the forest rearranged itself. Trails that should have been straight bent into spirals. Distances warped. I would walk for what felt like hours, only to end up in the same clearing I had left. I slowed my pace, trying not to panic, but every sense betrayed me. The forest muffled sound until my own footsteps seemed distant, out of sync with my body. When I paused, I swore I heard a second rhythm just behind me, footsteps echoing mine with a delay of half a beat, as if someone followed but stopped whenever I turned. My flashlight beam flickered across the trees, catching on bark and branches that looked disturbingly alike. Every tree seemed to wear the same face, grooves in the wood like scars, branches bent into identical angles. I began to feel as though I were not in a forest of many trees, but inside the repetition of a single, endless tree multiplied 1,000 times over. The night grew thicker. My bearings disintegrated completely. Stars were hidden behind the dense canopy, and even the moon seemed to vanish when I tried to rely on its light. My compass spun wildly, its needle twitching back and forth as if caught in some magnetic storm. Anxiety gave way to dread. The forest wasn't simply vast. It was alive, shaping itself against me, playing with my sense of direction like a cat with prey. I began to recognize the tricks. Paths folded back, not because I was careless, but because the terrain itself shifted. A ridge that should have sloped downward now rose against me. The stream I had heard earlier grew louder, then softer, then vanished entirely, only to return from the wrong direction. It was like walking through a mind that dreamed around me, adjusting its thoughts in real time. Hours stretched thin. My legs ached, my throat parched, my flashlight beam dulled with every passing minute. Yet the deeper dread came not from exhaustion, but from the realization that the forest wasn't merely confusing me. It was learning. With every step I took, it seemed to anticipate, to counter, to correct. I tried retracing my path once more, only to stumble into a clearing I recognized too well. The same circle of stones where I had first seen the figure. But the stones had changed. They were closer together now, smaller, their symbols sharper, etched deeper into their surfaces as though they had been carved anew while I wandered. The figure was gone, but the silence was the same, heavy, deliberate, waiting. I fled the clearing, heart hammering, crashing through brush without care for noise or stealth. My body burned with scratches from branches, my clothes torn, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. And yet, no matter how far I ran, the forest remained the same. Identical trees, endless shadows, whispering leaves. When I paused to catch my breath, bent double with exhaustion, I heard it again. Footsteps behind me, out of sync, imitating mine but not mine. I swung the flashlight wildly, its beam slicing through the dark. Nothing. But when I turned forward again, I realized the path before me was different. My markers were gone. My broken branches had realigned themselves. The piles of stones I had left were toppled or rearranged into strange new patterns. My trail had been erased and rewritten. The realization settled cold into my chest. The forest was not just alive, it was aware of me, actively correcting my attempts to escape. It had the power to heal, to shift, to alter the very structure of its body, and it had chosen to trap me within its endless cycle. The dread that followed was not the fear of death, but the fear of dissolution, to be lost so completely that I would cease to exist in memory, swallowed by the endless green, reduced to another whisper in the leaves, another set of prints erased by shifting soil. I staggered onward, more cautious now, speaking aloud just to remind myself I still existed. "I am here," I whispered. "I am real." The forest did not answer with words, but with sound, the faint tapping and rhythm, the soft rustle of branches, the occasional whisper of my name carried on the wind. And then, faintly, I saw light. At first, I thought it was the cabin. Relief surged. I stumbled toward it, calling out, only to stop short. The glow was not warm or familiar. It was pale, ghostly, emanating from a hollow in the trees. Inside the hollow, faint symbols glowed on the bark, the same ones etched into the stones. They pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, as if the forest itself were alive in its veins. The light vanished when I stepped closer, plunging me back into darkness. But the impression lingered. I was not just lost. I was inside something vast, deliberate, alive, and endlessly patient. By the time I collapsed against a fallen log, my body trembling with exhaustion, I knew the truth. Orientation was meaningless here. North, south, time, distance, all were illusions in the forest's domain. The only reality was the one it chose to present, and I was a piece in its game, a pawn wandering inside an endless dream that bent and shifted around me. And the dream was only beginning. When exhaustion dulled the edges of fear, thought perhaps I had begun to imagine the worst of it, that my disorientation was simply fatigue, that the forest was only a forest. But then I found the traces. The first was subtle, a set of footprints half buried in moss. Not mine. I had been careful to notice the shape of my boots in the soft soil, and these were narrower, longer, as if someone barefoot had passed before me. The prints pressed too deep for a light step, each indentation oddly elongated, as though the toes were unnaturally long, curling into the dirt. I crouched over them, breath caught, tracing their edges with trembling fingers. They weren't fresh. Damp moss had already begun to creep back into their outlines. But they weren't old either. Whoever left them had walked this way recently, and they weren't alone. As I scanned the ground, I realized the prints multiplied in every direction, some fading into the undergrowth, others overlapping, tangling. It was less like a single person had passed and more like a gathering had taken place. A congregation of strange feet circling, moving, dispersing. I followed one trail, flashlight beam trembling, and found more evidence. Claw marks etched into bark, deep gouges running high along a tree's trunk, higher than I could reach, higher than any man could reach without climbing. They were not random scratches, either, but deliberate. Symbols, patterns. At first glance, they looked like crude shapes, but the longer I studied them, the clearer their symmetry became. Spirals meeting at perfect intersections, lines forming repeating grids. The same marks I had seen glowing on the stones, now carved into living wood. The forest was marked, branded, as though claimed. The deeper I searched, the more I found. A patch of earth had been disturbed, soil dug out and hastily covered again, as though something had been buried. The air above it smelled faintly metallic, sharp and acrid, like rusted iron or blood. I knelt, hesitating, then dug with my hands. My fingers struck cloth, damp and rough. I pulled, but the earth resisted, as if it clung to its secret. Finally, I tore free a fragment, a shred of fabric, dark with soil and stiffened with something that crackled when I unfolded it. Under my flashlight, the truth gleamed. Dried blood, flaking in my hand. The forest had hidden more than symbols. It had hidden evidence of people of violence. I wanted to leave it, to cover the hole again, but curiosity gnawed at me. I dug deeper until my nails scraped something solid. Bone. Small. Human. I dropped the fragment, heart racing, and shoved soil back into the hollow, trying to erase what I had uncovered. But the image seared into my mind. Not just wandering souls, not just whispers, but human remains. Proof that someone, or something, had claimed lives here. The forest rustled as though in answer. Leaves trembled without wind. Branches creaked as though weight shifted overhead. I froze, listening, waiting for the sound of pursuit. Nothing came. But I knew then that my searching was not unnoticed. I pressed forward, faster, until I stumbled into another clearing. This one was different. At its center lay a circle, not of stones, but of bones. Small animals, mostly. Birds, rabbits, even a fox. Their skeletons had been arranged deliberately. Skulls pointing inward, spines forming spokes like a wheel. At the heart of the wheel was something worse. A doll. It was crude, made of sticks bound with twine. Its torso wrapped in the same kind of fabric I had found buried, stained dark with dried blood. Its head was a bundle of roots, bound tight, with hollow sockets carved into it, like empty eyes staring outward. The doll sat upright, propped as though waiting, as though placed deliberately as a sentinel. My chest tightened. The air in the clearing was heavier than the rest of the forest, thick with a sour, sweet smell of rot masked by damp earth. My flashlight beam trembled as it passed over the doll, and for a moment, I swore the sockets glistened wet, as though something within watched me through them. I wanted to turn back, but my legs betrayed me. I circled the arrangement, careful not to step inside, every sense screaming that to disturb the pattern would mean inviting something closer. That was when I saw the second circle, fainter, drawn into the earth itself, surrounding the first. A wide ring etched with symbols like those carved into the bark, each groove filled with ash. Charred fragments of wood littered the edges, suggesting fire had once been kindled there. Ritual fire. The thought turned my stomach. This was not chance. This was not the wild whim of an untamed forest. This was deliberate. The traces were not of a lost traveler, but of ceremony, repeated and reinforced, etched into the land itself. As I backed away, a low sound carried through the trees. Not an animal, not the wind. A hum, deep and resonant, vibrating faintly in the soil beneath my feet. It rose and fell, a cadence almost like chanting, too distant to make out words, but close enough to know it was human, or had once been human. The sound faded as suddenly as it came, leaving silence more dreadful than before. I retreated into the forest, unable to shake the feeling of unseen eyes on me. Every step revealed more traces. A length of rope dangling from a high branch, frayed and darkened. Piles of stones arranged into arrows that pointed not toward safety, but deeper into the woods. Feathers nailed into bark in careful, symmetrical rows. Each trace confirmed what I already feared. The forest was not simply alive. It was inhabited. And whatever inhabited it was not natural, not kind, and not bound by any laws I understood. By the time I collapsed against another tree, breathless, the truth pressed on me with suffocating clarity. I had not stumbled into a wild place. I had trespassed into a domain shaped by hands, or claws, that sought to keep it hidden. And now, they knew I was here. I wasn't sure how long I wandered after that. Minutes, hours, maybe the entire night. The forest had swallowed time along with direction. My flashlight's beam weakened, dimming with each shaky sweep, until I was left with only a trembling circle of light that revealed more shadows than it dispelled. And then, I wasn't alone. At first, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching faintly over damp leaves. Not mine. I was still, pressed against a tree, barely breathing. The sound approached from the darkness, unhurried, as if whoever, or whatever, moved had no need to rush. "Hello?" I called before I could stop myself, my voice cracking against the silence. The footsteps ceased. I should have run. Instead, I waited, trapped between the hope of human company and the certainty of something far worse. When the figure emerged from the gloom, relief and dread struck me at once. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. Tall, gaunt, shoulders bent as though weighed down by years. His clothes hung loose, old and tattered, coated in mud and ash. His skin was pale, stretched thin over sharp bones, and his eyes caught the light of my failing flashlight with a reflective gleam, too bright, too sharp, like an animal's. "Lost, are you?" he asked, his voice rasping like dry leaves. I swallowed hard. Yes, I think so." He smiled, though it was more a baring of teeth than an expression of comfort. Not the first to lose their way here. My mind screamed at me to back away, but my legs were locked, my exhaustion rooting me in place. "Do you live here?" I managed. The traveler tilted his head, considering. "Live? No. Survive, perhaps. This forest doesn't let anyone live in the way you mean." His gaze drifted past me into the trees, as though he saw things I couldn't. "It takes. It watches. It remembers." I shivered. "You've seen the symbols? The circles?" His laughter was low and hollow. "Seen them? Child, I've carved some myself." The words twisted my gut. He stepped closer, the smell of smoke and damp earth clinging to him. His boots, or what remained of them, were caked with soil that seemed fresh, as if he had been digging. I raised my flashlight higher, desperate to study his face, but he lifted a hand. Best not shine that too close. "Why?" "Because it doesn't like light," he said simply, eyes darting upward, as if the canopy itself might punish him for revealing the truth. I wanted to ask what it was, but my throat closed around the question. Instead, I whispered, "How do I get out?" The traveler's grin widened, splitting his gaunt features. "Out? There's no out. Not once you've come this deep. The paths you think you've walked, the trails, they bend. They turn you back without you knowing. You've already walked past the edge a dozen times, and still you circle here." My heart hammered. "That's not possible." "It is here." His voice hardened. "This place bends the rules. You think you hear your own thoughts, but sometimes they're not yours. Sometimes it whispers them in, makes you believe they came from inside." The idea chilled me more than the night air. I remembered the strange compulsion to follow the stone patterns, the sudden pull to investigate the clearing. Was it my curiosity, or something guiding me? "Why are you here?" I asked, forcing the words past my fear. The traveler's gaze flickered downward, his shoulders stiffening. For a long moment, He said nothing. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, he murmured, "I was brought. Same as you." My skin prickled. "By who?" "Not who." His eyes flashed, wild and frightened. Quote, "What?" A branch snapped in the distance, echoing through the trees. The traveler froze, his entire body tense, like a prey animal sensing its predator. He leaned in, his voice sharp and urgent. "It knows you're here. It never lets go once it's taken notice. Run when you can, but don't ever follow the voices. Do you understand?" I nodded, trembling. "Good," he rasped. "Then maybe you'll last longer than the others." Before I could respond, he stepped back into the shadows. His form melted into the darkness, his pale face vanishing as though it had never been. I called after him, once, twice, but only silence answered. And then, faintly, I heard it. Laughter. Not his. Higher, lighter, echoing faintly between the trees, like a child's giggle carried on the wind. It circled me, distant yet near, impossible to place. I spun with my fading flashlight, searching, but there was nothing. Only the trees, the night, and the memory of the traveler's warning. Don't follow the voices. Still, as the laughter faded, a part of me wanted to chase it, because it sounded so familiar, like someone I once knew. The laughter faded, but the forest didn't return to silence. It shifted. The trees groaned in unison, their branches rattling without wind, as though something unseen passed through them. My breath hitched, and I realized I was backing away, each step crunching over leaves far too loud against the hushed night. Truth. I wanted to believe it was only in my head. The traveler's warning had planted fear, and now my mind twisted every sound into a threat. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. They matched my pace at first, as though mocking me. I stopped. So did they. I quickened. So did they. The sound of something trailing me, no longer cautious, no longer hidden. I snapped the flashlight beam into the dark. For a heartbeat, I thought I caught the reflection of eyes, two pale glints staring back. Then gone. The panic rose sharp and hot. I turned and ran. Branches clawed at my arms, tore at my clothes. My light bounced wildly, catching flashes of bark, earth, and shadow that merged into one dizzying blur. The forest closed in, each tree seeming to lean forward, reaching to slow me. Behind me, the pursuit grew louder, footsteps heavy and uneven, accompanied now by the sound of something dragging through the underbrush. It wasn't just one. I could hear more, distinct rhythms overlapping. Some light, some pounding, some skittering in a way no human could move. A chorus of pursuit. I didn't dare look back. Fear gave me speed, but the forest gave me no mercy. Roots rose from the soil like skeletal fingers, catching my boots. I stumbled, caught myself, stumbled again. My lungs burned. My chest heaved, but the sounds closed in, encircling me. Through the chaos, a voice cut clear, a whisper so close it could have been spoken into my ear. This way. I nearly obeyed. The instinct was instant, as if something deep inside recognized the voice. But then I remembered the traveler's words. Don't follow the voices. I forced myself forward, ignoring the pull, though my head spun with confusion. Whose voice was it? Why did it sound like someone I loved? The ground sloped suddenly, sending me tumbling down an unseen hill. I crashed through brush, rolling hard until I slammed against a fallen log. Pain shot through my ribs, knocking the air from my lungs. My flashlight flew from my grip, skittering to a stop yards away. Its beam tilted upward to illuminate the trees. I crawled toward it, gasping when I froze. Silhouettes stood at the edge of the light. 3, 4, maybe more. Their forms stretched tall and wrong, limbs too long, torsos too thin, their heads cocked at unnatural angles. They didn't move, but I could hear them breathing. A wet, ragged sound, like air forced through water. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward them. Nothing. The beam cut only trees and empty forest, but the breathing didn't stop. I staggered upright, clutching the light, and ran again. My legs screamed in protest, but terror fueled them. The forest twisted in ways that no longer made sense. Paths doubled back, clearings repeated, landmarks shifted. I was caught in a maze designed to keep me running in circles, while whatever pursued me grew bolder. The voices returned, not whispers now, but calling. Familiar tones. My mother, my best friend, even my own voice calling from the dark. This way, over here. You're almost safe. Each word tried to hook me, pull me off balance, drag me toward the shadows. I clamped my hands over my ears, screaming, but the voices bled through bone and thought. At last I burst into a wider clearing, my chest heaving, body trembling. Moonlight broke through the canopy here. Faint, but enough to reveal a massive tree at the center. Its trunk was scarred with countless carvings, symbols I recognized from the stones and the bark. Spirals, circles, eyes. And at its base, a hollow. I didn't think. I just dove inside. The space was cramped, but it concealed me. I pressed against the rotting wood, forcing myself into stillness, heart pounding so loud I feared it would betray me. The pursuit stopped at the edge of the clearing. I could hear them moving, slow, deliberate, surrounding the tree. Their breathing rattled the air. One dragged something across the ground, a sickening scrape like metal over stone. And then, silence. I held my breath until my vision blurred, afraid even the faintest sound would give me away. Minutes passed, or hours. The forest held me in suspense until finally, footsteps receded, one by one. The sounds faded, swallowed by distance. I remained inside the hollow long after they had gone, paralyzed by fear. The traveler had been right. The forest didn't let go. It circled me, toyed with me, herded me like prey. And it wasn't finished. Inside the hollow tree, time dissolved into something unmeasurable. My legs cramped, my back ached, and the smell of damp rot pressed against me like a suffocating blanket. I should have felt safer in concealment, but the longer I crouched in the dark, the more it seemed the tree itself was aware of me. The bark against my skin felt warm at times, pulsing faintly, as though sap beneath it carried a heartbeat. My palm rested against the curve of the hollow, and I swore I felt it throb in rhythm with my own. Whether it was imagination or truth, I didn't know. But I couldn't shake the sense that the tree was not sheltering me. It was containing me. Still, I stayed. The memory of those figures circling the clearing kept me frozen. If I left too soon, they'd be waiting. At some point, exhaustion forced my eyes shut. I didn't sleep. True sleep was impossible. But I drifted in and out of a fog where dreams and reality tangled. In one, I was back in my car, headlights sweeping over the endless Appalachian roads. In another, I walked the trail again, but this time the traveler was beside me, whispering words I couldn't understand. When I startled awake, it wasn't silence that greeted me, but sound. A slow scratching, just outside the hollow. Something dragged nails or claws across the bark. The vibrations shuddered through the wood, into my spine. I covered my mouth, biting down to keep from crying out. The scratching stopped. Then came the voice. "Come out!" It was my own. Perfectly replicated, down to the tremor. Hearing it from outside my body made bile rise in my throat. "You're safe now. It's gone. You can leave." The bark around the hollow darkened as shadow passed over it. I stayed still, every muscle screaming for release. But I dared not move. For what felt like hours, the forest played with me. Sometimes laughter echoed. Sometimes footsteps circled. Sometimes silence fell so heavy I thought I'd gone deaf. Each time I almost broke, almost stepped into the clearing. Each time, I remembered the traveler's warning. Eventually, the sounds receded. The forest shifted into uneasy quiet, leaving me trembling and raw. That was when I decided, if I stayed in the hollow, I'd rot there. Whatever lived in these woods wanted me trapped in its games until I wore down. My only chance was to move, to make for higher ground and hope to find a vantage point, maybe even a way out. I crawled from the hollow at dawn. Pale light filtered through the canopy, weak but enough to remind me the world still had a sun. My legs barely held me, stiff from hours of crouching, but I forced them into motion. The clearing was empty. No figures, no footprints, only the massive tree, its carvings stark in the early light. For the first time, I saw them clearly, not random spirals, not simple circles. Eyes, countless eyes carved into the bark, staring outward in all directions. It watched. I tore my gaze away and moved, stumbling into the forest. Every step was torture, but I pushed deeper, searching for anything. A cabin, a signpost, even a stream to follow. My flashlight was nearly dead, useless now in daylight, but I clutched it anyway. A weapon, a comfort, a reminder that I wasn't completely powerless. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Hunger gnawed at me. Thirst burned my throat. But worse than that was the sense of pursuit that never left. The forest didn't forget me. Even when I couldn't hear them, I knew they followed, watching, waiting, hurting. At last, I found what I thought was salvation. A cabin. It leaned crooked against the trees, its roof sagging, its walls warped by rot. But it was shelter. Smoke-black stains ringed the windows, as if fire had once licked its frame. But the door still stood. I pushed it open, the wood groaning, and stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with mold and the faint tang of ash. The floor creaked, dust swirling in weak rays of light through cracks in the walls. An old table lay overturned, chairs broken, but in the corner was a cot, ragged but usable. For the first time since entering the forest, I exhaled. I barricaded the door with the table, set myself in the farthest corner, and let my body collapse. My eyes fluttered shut. Sleep stole me quickly, a desperate surrender. When I woke, night had fallen again, and I was not alone. From the other side of the room came breathing, slow, ragged, familiar. I froze, every hair on my body rising. I couldn't see it, but I felt it. Something sat in the shadows, watching. My flashlight flickered weakly as I lifted it. The beam cut across the room, illuminating the traveler. He sat on the cot, hands folded, eyes reflecting the light like an animal's once again. "You found it," he rasped. My mouth was dry. "What is this place?" "A refuge," he said, though his voice carried no reassurance. "But not yours, never yours." And as he smiled, the air thickened, and I realized the truth. I had not found safety. I had found their den. The traveler's smile held me captive more than his words. His teeth were yellowed, cracked, yet there was something predatory in them. Something that told me he wasn't smiling at me, but at the inevitability of what was coming. I didn't answer. My instinct screamed that to speak was to engage, and to engage was to lose. Instead, I backed slowly toward the barricaded door, my hands trembling around the fading flashlight. "You think you can leave?" he asked, voice scraping like rusted metal. "You've already been chosen. You're part of it now." I shoved the table aside, the wood groaning across the floor. The traveler rose, slow and deliberate, his long frame unfolding like a spider. His eyes gleamed brighter, catching the thin slice of moonlight through the broken wall. I yanked the door open and ran. The night air hit me like a wave, sharp and cold, filled with the damp musk of the forest. I sprinted blindly, the cabin shrinking behind me until it disappeared. Branches whipped across my arms, tearing cloth, drawing blood. My chest burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Behind me, the forest erupted. Not footsteps this time, but something worse. A chorus of noises. Laughter, guttural snarls, whispers in a dozen voices all layered into one. The trees shook as if something massive moved among them, snapping branches with deliberate force. They were coming. The ground sloped downward, and I followed it, hoping it might lead to water, to a river I could trace back to civilization. My boots slipped in mud, but momentum carried me forward. My flashlight flickered, threatening to die, until it finally did, plunging me into near-total darkness. Moonlight broke through patches of canopy, just enough to keep me from tumbling headfirst into roots and stones. I ran until my legs buckled and my body collapsed against a moss-slick boulder. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one a cloud in the cold night air. For a moment, silence. Then, footsteps again. Closer this time. Faster. I staggered up, forcing my legs into motion once more. The forest pressed tighter around me, funneling me toward a narrow ravine. Rocks jutted like broken teeth, slick with moisture. I slid down them, half climbing, half falling, until I landed hard at the bottom. There. Water. A stream, faint but real, cutting through the ravine floor. Relief surged in me. If I followed it, maybe it would lead to a river, and from there to people, to roads, to safety. I plunged into the water, icy cold biting into my skin. I followed it downstream, stumbling over stones, splashing through pools. The sound was deafening, masking the noises behind me, until they broke through again. The whispers. "You can't leave. It belongs to us. So do you." I clamped my hands over my ears, but the words pressed in from within, vibrating through my skull. My vision blurred, my legs weakened. Then, ahead, light. A faint glow shimmered at the end of the ravine. I forced myself forward, lungs screaming, heart pounding. As I drew closer, the glow sharpened into something unmistakable. A road. An actual road. I scrambled up the embankment, clawing at dirt and stone, pulling myself onto cracked asphalt. Tears stung my eyes. Relief nearly dropped me to my knees. The road stretched empty in both directions. But it was real, solid. Proof that the world beyond the forest still existed. Behind me, the ravine seethed with sound. Growls, whispers, the rustle of movement too large to name. But none of it crossed the threshold. It lingered at the tree line, as though bound to the forest's edge. I collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping. For the first time in days, or had it been only hours, I felt the weight lift. I was out, alive. But as I lay there beneath the pale moonlight, I realized something chilling. The forest had let me go. It hadn't failed to keep me. It had chosen to release me. And whatever reason it had, I knew it wasn't mercy. I don't remember how long I walked that road. Time folded in on itself, my legs carrying me on instinct alone. Eventually, headlights broke through the darkness, a truck rumbling toward me. I stumbled into its path, waving my arms, nearly collapsing from the sudden flood of light. The driver slammed on the brakes, the screech tearing through the still night. He jumped out, cursing, then froze when he saw me. I must have looked feral. Mud streaked across my clothes. Blood dried on my arms and face, eyes wild from sleepless terror. He asked if I was all right, if I needed a hospital, but the words tumbled out before I could stop them. "There's something in the forest," I gasped. "Not animals, not people. Something else. It's alive, the whole place. It changes, it watches. You can't go there. No one should. It's..." The man's expression shifted from concern to confusion, then to polite dismissal. He guided me into the passenger seat, telling me to calm down, that I was safe now. But I wasn't. Safety was an illusion. I tried again as the truck rumbled down the empty highway. I told him about the voices, the traveler, the way the forest moved. My voice cracked, desperate for him to believe. But the more I spoke, the more his jaw tightened. By the time we reached the nearest sheriff's office, he wouldn't even look at me. Inside, under the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, I repeated my story to men in uniforms. They wrote notes, exchanged glances, asked me if I had been drinking, if I had taken anything before entering the woods. "No," I shouted. "You don't understand. It's real. It's out there." One of them sighed, leaned back in his chair. "Son, do you know how many folks come through here with stories like yours? Strange lights, voices in the trees, monsters in the dark. We hear it every year. You've been out in the woods too long. That's all." I slammed my fist on the desk. "No! I'm telling you the truth." But my words bounced off them like stones against steel. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes glazed with practiced indifference. I realized then they had already decided what I was. Not a witness, not a survivor, a fool. They made a few calls. A paramedic checked me over, said I was dehydrated, exhausted, probably hallucinating. They offered to keep me overnight for observation. When I refused, they let me go with a warning: stay out of the forest, get some rest, and stop scaring people with tall tales. That was their solution. Not investigation, not caution, just dismissal. As I walked out of the station, the night air hit me again, colder now, sharper. The town lights glowed warm in the distance, but none of it comforted me, because I knew the truth. Truth they refused to hear. The forest wasn't just alive, it was waiting. And it would keep waiting until the next person wandered in, unsuspecting, unprepared. I tried to sleep that night, in a cheap motel room with walls thin as paper. But every creak of the building, every rustle of wind outside made my body tense, made me fear the forest had stretched its reach beyond the trees. And worst of all, I realized something else. If no one believed me, if everyone dismissed me as just another lunatic traveler with a story too wild to trust, then I was alone. Completely alone with the knowledge of what lurked in those mountains. And the forest wanted it that way. The morning sun cast long, pale streaks through the thin curtains of the motel room. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet, replaying everything in my mind again and again. Maybe if I told it differently, more carefully, more rationally, someone would believe me. Someone had to. So I tried again. I went to the diner across from the motel, ordered coffee I barely touched, and struck up a conversation with the waitress. She looked kind, approachable. Maybe she would listen. "There's something wrong with those woods," I whispered, leaning across the table. "Something people don't see or don't want to see." She tilted her head, polite smile frozen in place. When I told her what I had seen, the moving trees, the voices, the traveler with no face, the smile faltered. She laughed nervously, said, "That's quite a story," then excused herself to check on another customer. Her eyes avoided mine after that. At the grocery store, I overheard two locals talking about hunters missing in the mountains. I joined their conversation, desperate to prove I wasn't alone in what I'd witnessed. But when I shared my account, they looked at each other, then at me, and muttered something about out-of-towners making things up. They walked away, shaking their heads. It was always the same. The gas station clerk, the bartender at the dusty roadside bar, even the old man sitting on his porch smoking and rocking slowly as if waiting for the world to end. Every time I spoke, their eyes glazed over, their mouths set into thin lines of disbelief. Some of them laughed. Others grew annoyed. A few looked genuinely uncomfortable, like I was breaking some unspoken rule by mentioning the forest at all. And the more I spoke, the more I felt their patience thinning. That night, back at the motel, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find two deputies waiting, hands resting on their belts. "Evening," one said. His voice was calm, but his eyes weren't. "We've had some reports you've been bothering folks around town with your stories. I'm just trying to warn them," I insisted. "You don't understand." "Sir," the deputy cut in, firm now. "Whatever you think you saw out there, the people around here don't need to hear it. You're scaring folks. If you keep this up, we'll have to escort you out of town." I froze, anger bubbling beneath my exhaustion. "So that's it? You'd rather silence me than face the truth?" The other deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Sometimes people don't want the truth. They want peace." And with that, they left me standing in the doorway, heart pounding, ears ringing. Peace. That word echoed in my mind long after the door closed. Peace for them, silence for me. By the third day, I stopped trying. The town had made up its mind. I was the outsider, the troublemaker, the fool spinning campfire tales. The motel clerk avoided my eyes when I passed the front desk. People on the sidewalk crossed the street rather than walk near me. Conversations fell quiet when I entered a room. It was as though the forest itself had reached into their minds, twisting their perception, urging them to reject me. And maybe it didn't have to try very hard. Humans after all, have always been good at dismissing what they don't want to believe. One evening, desperate for some sign of validation, I returned to the sheriff's office. "I need to speak with you," I demanded. "Please, just listen. Just check the woods yourself. Send someone. You'll see I'm not lying." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, chewing on the end of a toothpick. His eyes were tired, weary, in a way that told me he'd heard this all before. "You know what I think?" he said finally. "I think you scared yourself. Got lost in the dark, heard some animals, maybe some locals messing around. Your mind filled in the rest." "No," I whispered. "It wasn't in my mind." He leaned forward, his tone dropping into something harder. "Then maybe your mind isn't right. Either way, son, it's not our problem." And just like that, I was dismissed again, filed away under a crazy stranger, another voice lost in the static of old Appalachian legends. I left the station, feeling smaller than I ever had before. It hit me then. The forest didn't need to kill me. It didn't need to chase me beyond its borders. All it had to do was let me speak, because no one would ever believe me. I realized quickly that disbelief wasn't enough for the town. It wasn't enough for me to simply be ignored, brushed off as another drifter with too much imagination. The longer I stayed, the more I noticed the subtle shift in the way people looked at me. At first, it was annoyance, then suspicion, and finally, fear. It started with whispers. I'd walk into the diner for breakfast and hear them. Voices dropping to a hush, words swallowed when I got close. The waitress who once gave me polite smiles now placed my coffee down without a word, her hand trembling just enough to spill a drop onto the counter. At the grocery store, the cashier's hand paused before taking my money. She forced a smile, but her eyes betrayed her. She thought I was dangerous. The motel clerk, who once chatted about the weather, now slid my key across the counter without meeting my gaze. I heard him on the phone one night, his voice low, saying, "He's still here." And then came the warnings. A folded piece of paper shoved under my door. "Leave." A rock through the motel window with no one around to claim it. The sheriff's deputies returning, not with words of caution this time, but with an unspoken threat in the way they lingered at my door. "You're wearing out your welcome," one of them said flatly. I understood then. They didn't just want me quiet, they wanted me gone. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not when the forest still breathed down my neck, pressing against my thoughts. It was as if the trees themselves wanted me erased, and the town, knowingly or not, had become its instrument. The worst moment came 3 nights before I finally left. I had been tossing in bed, sleep impossible, when I heard it. A soft sound. Not from the woods this time, but from inside the motel. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, heavy, stopping right outside my door. I held my breath. A shadow passed across the thin gap under the door. Then a low voice, barely audible. "Stop talking." My skin crawled. I pressed myself against the wall, heart slamming in my chest, too afraid to move. The footsteps lingered, pacing back and forth before retreating into silence. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the motel clerk told me my stay had been cut short. No refund, no explanation. Just an order to pack up and leave by sundown. And so I did. I drove out of that town with cracked glass, frayed nerves, and a story that no one wanted to hear. But even now, as I speak these words into the void, I feel the weight of their silencing. It wasn't just rejection. It wasn't disbelief. It was control. The forest didn't need to kill me, and the town didn't need to hurt me. All they had to do was convince the world that my voice didn't matter, that my truth was nothing more than madness. And that is how silence wins. Huh.